Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in for the third virtual Applied Development Economics webinar, which is jointly organized by the Lahore School of Economics, the International Growth Center, and the Consortium for Development Policy Research in Pakistan. We're very excited to have with us today Dr. Sheheryar Banuri, who's Associate Professor at the University of East Anglia. He's a behavioral economist with expertise on motivation and incentives, behavior, and public policy. His work has provided policy guidance to several developing country governments around the world, and his work has also been published in some leading academic journals such as Social Science and Medicine, the European Economic Review, the World Bank Economic Review, etc. He's also been an active contributor over the years to World Bank's annual World Development Report. So before I hand over to Dr. Banuri, I will just quickly go over some housekeeping rules. We will have Dr. Banuri speak for about 40 minutes. During this time, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function to post questions. At the end, we will keep about 15 to 20 minutes for question and answers. And during this time, you can use the raise hand function and we will unmute you so that you can ask your questions. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Banuri.
Okay. Thank you very much. I need to share my screen, but I think you have to share. Sure. Stop sharing.
Yes, I'm just going to do that.
Thank you.
So you can go ahead and share yours now.
Great, thank you. Let's see, so let me get this there. Okay, everything all set? You can see me and hear me? Yeah, okay, great. All right, well, thank you very much for inviting me to the workshop. I'm really delighted and happy to be here. And I'm actually excited to present this paper, which we just finished. Well, finished. We're still kind of tooling it and working on it, but we finished our first draft last week, or 2 weeks ago. So comments are very much welcome, clarifications and things. So please feel free to chime in. And I want to start by this quote from. Oh, sorry. This quote from our famous and lovely John Stuart Mill: "Men don't desire to be rich, but richer than other men." It's actually not necessarily found in any of his writings, or at least in any of his writings that I could find. But the idea of this kind of got codified into what we now understand as the relative income hypothesis, which is most directly attributed to Dusenberry in 1950. And the idea is that it's not just about me wanting money. I want more than other people, right? That's the main thing, that relative income is what we need to care about and less about absolute income. Now, I also wanted to kind of explain the title. So the title is Borrowing to Keep Up. And that comes from this phrase, which is keeping up with the Joneses. Now, some of you might already know about this, some of you don't. I actually was kind of fascinated to learn about the history of this. So one of the sources of this phrase comes from, well, it's kind of a legend now almost, comes from Edith Wharton. Edith Wharton is a very famous writer, one of the first, not one of the first female Pulitzer Prize winner. She wrote this book, The Age of Innocence, which talks about the Gilded Age. She was born Elizabeth Jones, Edith Jones, born into the Jones family. And the Jones family was a prominent family in New York. During this time of the Gilded Age, right? So US is growing, it's, the mid 1800s, things are moving and shaking. And in New York, there's a big concentration of wealth. Lots and lots of rich people concentrated there. The Jones family is kind of an upcoming family. I mean, they're also wealthy. They've got railroad investments and things like that, but they're not maybe at the peak yet. Then a marriage happens. Isaac Jones gets married to the daughter of John Mason. Daughter is Mary Mason. And John Mason is famous because he is the president of the Chemical Bank. The Chemical Bank it's now known as Chase Bank. It was there at that time called the Chemical Bank, and he was fabulously wealthy. He also had a bit of a falling out with his son, so he kind of favored Isaac Jones. And so Isaac Jones became the third president of Chemical Bank, and then his cousin, I can't remember his full name, became the fourth president. And so with this, there came an almost meteoric rise in the Jones family in wealth. I mean, they were already pretty wealthy, but they also started to improve. And that led to them building this mansion, Wyncliffe Mansion, which is still found, the ruins of this are still found in the historic district in New York. This prompted other families to build similar mansions nearby, right? And so this race of public displays of wealth kind of started and hence led to this phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, which I thought was a pretty fascinating story. It almost is legendary. I mean, it's hard to corroborate, but that's one idea of the origination. And so I wanted to talk about weddings. I promised that we'll talk about weddings. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some famous weddings and the expenses that they've incurred. And I'm going to go over those very, very quickly. This picture is a little bit unfair about Saqib Nisar. This is not one of the super famous weddings. When we're talking about super famous weddings, we're talking about Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, estimated 18 million. Prince William and Kate Middleton, 34 million. This one was famous, Mithil and Bhatia in 2016, 66 million. Charles and Diana, an estimated 110 million. Did you know this? This was fun to research. I didn't realize, but this was a huge expense. Not the most expensive. The most expensive, we haven't really even estimated. It's just a best guess, which is Russian billionaires who spent about $1 billion. So this is the son of a famous Russian billionaire. And this was, oh gosh, I don't even remember, 2016 as well. Apparently 2016 had a lot of very expensive weddings. Now the question with these sorts of weddings is why? I mean, it's outrageous, isn't it? Although we've all been there. I mean, everybody who's had weddings in their family, and we're economists, we're kind of like, oh, why are we having to spend all this money? And it's not just, I mean, one of the things we need to underscore is it's not just a rich person phenomenon, and not just a wealthy country phenomena. It's very much a developing country phenomena. And in fact, rural weddings have, particularly from our part of the world, so India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, have had a disproportionate amount of oversight in the literature, right? There's quite a lot of papers that talk about it. I wanted to give you a quote from this paper, which is, I mean, it's just the first two sentences of Biju Rao's and Francis Bloch and Desai's paper in 2004. Daughter's marriage, most costly event, driving parents into severe debt at interest rates of 200%, can put people into bonded labor, especially if there's several daughters to be married. And in the paper, they actually go beyond, because a lot of this literature focuses on dowries, and dowries is sort of a bulk of the expense a lot of times, but wedding celebrations is what this paper focuses on, finds that there is a lot of expenses spent on families, on celebrations, which are just, pure, according to them, status signaling behavior. It's quite fascinating. So One of the answers to why is that it's about signaling social status in the community. And now this has not, it's not just about weddings, though. It's actually about a lot of goods, which we sort of largely classify as luxury goods. And if you look at the luxury goods market, so this is a graph from Bain and Co. That study the luxury goods market. They find year on year steady increases, except for this little downturn during the crisis, steady increases in the luxury good market from the mid-90s when they started tracking them to today. It's not clear what how the pandemic is going to affect things, but at least for now, in 2018, 2019, growth was fairly stable. Most of it is in things like cars, hospitality, fine wine, spirits, experiences, those sorts of things. Those are the major elements of growth. And it might surprise you, maybe not, most of the growth in the last decade anyway is attributed directly to Asia. Yeah, so about 65% of the consumption in global luxury goods market is coming from Asia. Specifically, of course, China is a big bulk of this with their growth levels, but also Japan and other Asian countries as well. So it's a huge it's a sizable aspect of the economy. There's lots of people spending money on it, and the question is, well, why is it happening? Now, I talked about the Gilded Age during this development of the phrase "keeping up with the Joneses." Thorstein Veblen wrote The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899. Yeah, and there he's kind of, at that time the book wasn't very well received by economists. He's kind of an economist and a sociologist. Economists aren't always kindly to people who are that interdisciplinary, and in 1899 I think that might have been even more so. But I think if you're going to pick it up, it's a tough read, but chapter 2 is particularly interesting. So there he talks about two things. One is conspicuous consumption, in that we consume to signal status. And there's a reason why we signal status, and he traces it back to hunter-gatherer societies and even feudal societies. And then he says, well, in the age of industrialization, it's something that we've kept up with. But the other thing that he talks about is pecuniary emulation. That is, that people at the top of the social status sort of ladder, if you like, they're going to consume what they're going to consume. And they'll signal status because they can. But then those of us at the lower end, I'm sorry, I'm including all of us in this, but those of us at the lower end, we're academics, we're at the lower end, let's face it. We engage in what's called pecuniary emulation, that we also want to signal status. And this urge is so strong that what we'll do is we'll emulate the behavior of those people that are ahead of us. Now, let's just be a bit more technical, and then I'm going to come back to the literature, and then I'll talk about the experiments, right? So conspicuous consumption, specifically, Veblen defines it: purchase of luxury goods and services for the purpose of attaining or displaying status. What is a luxury good? A luxury good is a good that costs more, even though there's a functionally equivalent good, right? And the demand is increasing in price as opposed to decreasing in price. Now, this issue of status goods and prestige, it's been around in the literature for a long time. 1899, Adam Smith was talking about it. 1950, relative income hypothesis comes around. John Stuart Mill talks about it. And then every decade or so, you see a smattering of papers that talk about it. A lot of times it's in developed countries, but then, Kaushik Basu in 1989, I'm a big fan of Kaushik, he was noticing that, look, as you're expanding credit into developing countries, one thing you have to watch out for is people borrowing money to engage in conspicuous consumption, because that can in fact be crippling. And that's an idea that we're going to we're going to test in our paper. So sorry, lots of setup. I'll get into the experiment very quickly. Before I do, I can't help but pick on people who buy Beats headphones. We know that Beats headphones there's functionally equivalent headphones. Dr. Dre is a marketing genius. He's, I think, the first African-American billionaire, if I'm not wrong, on the back of Beats headphones, which technically are the same as other headphones, but cost about 5 times more. And anyway, that's an example of a luxury good. Another example of a luxury good that my brother tells me anyway, is this Maserati and BMW comparison. These cars, I don't know what kind they are, but they're very, very similar in terms of their engine specs and stuff like that. But the Maserati is way more expensive than the BMW, which is also, by the way, if you ask me, also already a luxury car. But anyway, he asked me to put this in, so I put this in. Okay. So here's some key papers. I'm not going to cover all of them, but there's a few that I want to highlight. So Urzo Lutmer in 2005, he's looking at happiness. Yeah? And what he looks at is income and happiness. And what he finds is that if you increase somebody's income by 10% or so, their happiness increases by something, right? Let's say it's 5%. If you increase their neighbor's income by 10%, their happiness decreases by the same magnitude. Yeah. So it's not just that we want, it's John Stuart Mill, right? I don't want to be rich. I just want to be richer than you. Then you see other sort of papers that kind of talk about the same thing. So Bertrand and Morse, this very famous paper, looked at data from 80 to 2008 leading up to the crisis. And they found that households that lived in areas that were exposed to higher income households, basically, increased their consumption levels. So your income remains the same, but you have rich neighbors that move in, you increase your consumption. Okay, and they also identified that the consumption is of more visible goods and services, right? So stuff that you can see. I think another paper that's kind of important on this, Agarwal et al. In 2020, it's very recent. Lottery win of one Canadian neighbor increases borrowing and bankruptcies among neighbors. Bankruptcies among neighbors. So if you live next to a lottery winner, you better watch out, because chances are it's going to hurt you pretty badly. Bernstein et al., they do this paper. So again, that's a Canadian paper in Indonesia. They have they look at the demand for platinum credit cards. So just credit cards with this label platinum. And they find that that demand is much higher, especially amongst poorer households. Okay? Now, there's good reasons why it could be alternative explanations. I mean, they kind of say it's status goods, but they don't quite nail it. And the reason why is because, I mean, you're poorer, you have less time, for example, you don't have time to look into whether or not platinum is indeed better or the same or anything like that. Who has time for that anyway? Platinum signals good, you just go for it, right? So there's different reasons why these things can happen, but it seems to be about signaling status. And what we want to do is use the lab to kind of nail this. Okay. One paper I really quickly want to highlight, and then I know there's a lot of setup, and then we'll talk about the experiment, is this cute paper. Well, cute, it's really nice actually, and the paper we build heavily upon, by David Klingensmith and Roman Shermeta, 2018, where they studied behavior in the lab. They had people take a quiz, and then they asked them, would you want to buy these chocolate truffles? Now, these are chocolate truffles that people can buy in the real world. They're kind of expensive. Why would you want? They subsidize it in the lab, so you kind of want to buy them. And in one treatment, they rank you based on your performance in the quiz, but they only tell you. Nobody can see how many truffles you bought. In another treatment, they make it public. They'll say, oh, Farah bought 20 truffles and Mariam bought 28 truffles. And that means something, right? That means that Mariam did better on the quiz than Farah. right? And then what you see is a demand for truffles increases when that is made public. So that's cute. We kind of want to bring that. And of course, it's about quiz, a performance on a quiz. So we want to kind of test the boundaries of this idea. Okay. All right. So what we're doing is an experiment. It's a lab experiment. We're going to establish consumption in the lab. Yes, it can be done. David and Roman have already kind of done it, but we make some important changes and largely replicate what they have. Alongside that, we're going to introduce access to loans. So that's, and then we're going to look at the impact that has on inequality. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what we're doing. We're going to observe purchasing behavior in a lab setting. We're going to look at the impact of observability, so make consumption conspicuous or not. We're going to look at the impact of inequality, which we interpret as status signaling. And then we're going to look at the impact of loans. So you can think of it like, it's easy to think of it as a video game. And we'll kind of keep that idea throughout. I'll skip this for now. We can come back to this if we want. Why do you want the lab to study these things? I don't have time, so we'll skip it, but we can come back to it in the discussion. Here's a preview of the results, just in case I don't have time to get through all of them. We find consumption increases when it's observable and signals ability or status. So when consumption is conspicuous, people engage more in it, even though this consumption is really, really silly. And I'll show you why it's silly. But it's kind of silly and it's kind of not. So you'll see what I mean. Loan taking increases when consumption is conspicuous. So people actually take more loans when we make consumption conspicuous, and that's an important result. Another one is this increase in loan taking is primarily driven by the poorest. So the lowest income strata is the one that's borrowing more, and they're the ones who are trying to borrow to keep up, right? To keep up with the Joneses. And ultimately what we find is access to credit then exacerbates this inequality. Okay. So any questions so far, or shall I just continue?
So there's been a question by Fayaz Bakir who asked, do birth and funeral events also fall in the luxury goods market? If not, why not?
Well, I guess it depends on how you play it, right? I mean, you could have funeral goods. I mean, certainly there's price differentiation in caskets. We see this, at least in the West anyway. We see this all the time. There's massive increases, decreases. Then funeral directors will try and upsell you on various things, right? You can have an open casket, somebody puts a smile on you, makeup, quality of flowers, things like this. Again, any sort of any sort of environment where you can potentially signal status lends itself to conspicuous consumption. Yeah, but it's a good question. I mean, birthday celebrations, I think Kim and Kanye did their kids' celebration with Beyonce. I mean, come on. I think almost everybody knows that's conspicuous consumption. Yeah. But good question. Okay, so what we're doing is a 2x2x2 design. Okay, so this is a between subjects design. This means something in particular. If you're not familiar with experimental terminology, that's fine. We can talk about it at the end. But the idea is that what we're doing is we're varying 3 factors. So we're varying observability. I'll break down each one, but just in brief, we're going to vary observability, whether purchasing is observed by peers or not. We're going to vary inequality, whether or not you earned your endowment or whether I just gave it to you. And then we're going to vary loans, whether or not you can borrow money to purchase things. And I'll explain what that means in a second, right? And we're going to do the full set. So we end up with 8 treatments. And what you see here is the number of observations per treatment. So we've got about 650 observations. Here's a timeline. You have people, so people read the instructions, They'll do a coding task if they're in the inequality treatments. If not, they'll go directly to the consumption phase. They'll do a survey, and then they'll get paid, right? It's important to keep that framework in your mind. I'll come back to this in a second. Here's the baseline. This is what the consumption phase looks like. And this is where I either lose you or you're with me, right? So if the number of participants start to drop dramatically, we know that this is what you're unhappy with. So this is how we get students to purchase things. I'm going to give you, in a baseline, I'm going to give you 20 tokens per round. I'm going to call it 20 million tokens because this is a big amount, okay, per round for 10 rounds. All right, so you're going to get 200 million tokens in total. Big money, right? By the way, the million is kind of a nice touch, I think. It doesn't matter, it's really 20, but we put million at the end of everything and it feels nicer. You can think about these 10 rounds as a lifetime. So, and tokens will accumulate over time. So round 1, you'll have 20, round 2, you'll have 40, round 3, you'll have 60, and so on, right? So you'll get access to more and more money as time goes on. Subjects are given verbal descriptions of 25 items and their prices. Prices are in millions, just the descriptions, right? Not verbal, written descriptions of these items. These are all high ticket items from the real world that you might be curious about. Okay, so these are actual real world expensive items. And what you can do is you can purchase a picture. So you'll be able to see that item. That's what purchasing is. It's a virtual good. So all you'll see is a picture. At the end of the experiment, there's nothing for you to take away. I'm not printing out the picture. All you have is your memory, and that's what you're paying money for, right? And you're saying, and I know some of you are saying, that's crazy. Yes, but it works. Now, I don't want people to walk out with nothing, so I'm going to give them back some small percentage, well, in this case, 60% of the purchase price back at the end of the round. It turns out that's a feature that we can sort of talk about at the end, whether or not you like it or not. Okay, prices are set, and this is why loans are important. Prices are set such that some items are affordable immediately and others become affordable in later rounds, okay? So here's the list of prices. So I've got 25 items. You'll see the prices start with 1 million, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, so on, all the way up to, sorry, the screen's being covered, all the way up to, I think it's like 155 million for most expensive item. In round 1, you can only afford the first 11 items. The rest of the items are unaffordable to you. But in round 2, you can afford a few more if you don't spend any money. In round 3, you can afford a few more. By the 7th round, you can afford any one individual item. But what's important is you will never have enough money to buy all the items. So you'll only have enough money to buy a few, right? And you have to choose how you want to buy the items. And these are all luxury items. These are the items. So we have phones. They're bejeweled phones. Actually cost millions of, well, these are old phones now, and you can kind of tell how old some of this data is. It's about 3 years old. But some of these phones are actually even older than that. We've got paintings, real paintings using their real world prices. We've got Gustav Klimt, we've got Picasso, we've got other ones. Private islands, you can buy a private island if you like. We've got a few of those. We've got stately manors. This one on the right is Dracula's castle in Romania, which is actually up for sale. You can buy it if you want, or buy a picture or a memory of it in the experiment. You can buy yachts. And by the way, the yachts are the most expensive things, more so than private islands. Who knew? We can talk about the decision screen. Here's the display. I'm going to show you a description of the items. These are the descriptions. So all you see is the verbal descriptions. And then if you purchase the item, then you see a picture. And we give you all the information. We do all the math for you. So don't worry about any of that. Okay. So just quickly, that's how purchasing works. 10 rounds. Each round is fixed at 3 minutes. So a total of 30 minutes in the consumption phase. and yeah, no way to speed it up. But if you want to earn as much as possible, you have to sit there for 30 minutes and do absolutely nothing, which, by the way, is also kind of hard to do. In the baseline, nobody can observe what you purchase except for us, the experimenters, of course, but no peers can observe what you purchase. Okay, then observability. So factor one, that just changes observability. What I do is I put you in groups of 4, and I give each of the group member a label, person 1, 2, 3, 4. And at the end of the round, I just display to everybody in the group what they purchased, the total amount of their purchases, and the items that they purchased. So you can see a description of what they purchased, but you can't see the picture, obviously. It's also possible that for you to purchase the same item. So it's not exclusive, right? We both can purchase Bram Stoker's, Dracula's castle. In effort-based inequality, we have an effort task. So now this is a stupid effort task that people have used in other contests. It's not a quiz. It's not intellectual ability. This is a decoding task. So I give you a cipher, I give you a bunch of letters and a bunch of numbers, and then I give you a code, and then I ask you to decode it. You have to do this in 10 rounds, and that generates the endowment that you're going to use for your purchases. Okay, so that generates inequality based on ability in this totally stupid, who cares whether I'm good at this task or not. But it turns out people do care whether they're good at this task or not, and I'll show you how. That's where the coding task happens. So the coding task happens just before the consumption phase, and only in the treatments where we have inequality. And then finally, we have loans. Loans are expensive. What you can use loans for is to front load consumption. So stuff that wasn't available to you at later rounds, you can push it to earlier rounds. Yeah, is that clear? So basically, you can't purchase more items than you otherwise would. The only thing you can do is purchase high-ticket items in earlier rounds, and you pay a cost to do so. So purchasing is already costly, and then loans on top of that are yet another cost, which we calculate and tell all the students what it is and subjects what it is. Repayments are automatically calculated, spread over the remaining rounds. You can't default, nothing like that, right? Completely controlled environment, and you're forced to pay back everything. It's clear that loans are a bad idea. Just be patient, and yet you'll see the effect that it has on consumption. Okay, so here it's the prices of luxury items. So for example, if you wanted to buy a yacht in round 1, you can only do that in the loans stream. And then we have additional measures, which I don't really have time to talk about, so I'll keep it very, very brief. One of these things that we mentioned that is kind of important is this consumption behavior in the past week. So what we wanted to know, I mean, in setting up a kind of an experiment like this, you're worried that whether or not consumption in the lab is capturing some aspect of real world consumption. So we ask a few questions about consumption behavior in the past week, and I'll show you there's a correlation. It's weak, but it's there between real world consumption and consumption in the experiment. So we feel a little bit better. That's capturing, at least in some degree, real world consumption. Okay, the timeline once again. And I know I'm talking for a long time, but the results are fairly straightforward. I think you'll see, so we'll kind of blast through them. Here's summary statistics. Again, we can go over them. They're more or less balanced. One thing that I will say is, even though we tried to keep the endowments the same in the unequal treatments with the effort task, we didn't quite hit the mark. So they are a little bit higher than the sort of fixed endowments ones of 20. So they're about 21, 22. And so we can control for that, right? We adjust all expenditure relative to your endowment levels so that we control for differences in endowments across treatments. but the rest of the things are fairly well balanced. Okay, results. First, I said, is it even consumption? So we measure real world consumption by asking 5 questions, thinking about this past week. How frequently did you eat out? Did you go out for a drink? Did you see a movie? Did you buy something that you did not really need? How frequently did you buy something and returned it? And so we just take responses to these questions, we average it up, and that becomes our real world consumption measure. And so what we do in this graph is just very simply plot total expenditure in tokens on the y-axis, and the average of these consumption questions on the x-axis across all observations. And what we find is a weak but strong, statistically significant positive correlation. So the more you consume in the real world, the more you're also consuming in our experiment. So to some degree, we're capturing real world consumption. Okay, then we're saying, okay, well, what is it that makes consumption conspicuous? And here we're kind of taking a leaf from Roman and David's paper. So Roman and David said, look, it's 2 things. You need to be able to signal status, and you need to be able to signal status to somebody else, not to yourself, right? And so this observability and this status signaling needs to be there for consumption to be called conspicuous. And what you should see is an increase in consumption when that happens. And so what we do is we plot expenditure. So this is average expenditure as a percentage, expressed as a percentage of endowment across all treatments, pooled with loans and no loan treatments. On the left is when you have an equal endowment. So I just give you money, you don't work for it. And the light gray bars are when expenditure is not observable. So now you're spending money, nobody can see, versus the dark gray bars where expenditure is observable. You have peers who can see your expenditure. And what you see is a reduction in expenditure when other people are viewing it, when it's an equal endowment, right? And the reason for that is it's not selling anything. In fact, expenditure is kind of signaling that you're a little bit silly, right? Because what you're going to do is we get the same amount of wealth, but if I spend more money, I'll walk away with less money than you, right? So that dampens expenditure in that condition. Now, the bars on the right are when you work for your endowment, right? When you have unequal, but it's effort-based endowment. So now purchasing can signal your ability. And what you see is an increase, a significant increase in expenditure when expenditure becomes observable. So you react to your peers viewing your purchasing or viewing your status signals by purchasing more. In fact, that's the only way to signal how well you did in this silly effort task, which, by the way, nobody should care about, right? But as long as we view it, you can see how a quiz would view your cognitive ability or something like this. But I have to stress, we picked this effort task because it's correlated with nothing. It's not correlated with your ability, your IQ. It's not correlated with, it may be correlated with your motor skills, right? So you can manipulate the keyboard and move the mouse really, really nicely. If you care about signaling that, that's fine. But even in such a benign aspect, people care about signaling ability. So that already we thought was remarkable and a departure from David and Roman. Here's a regression. I'm going to quickly glaze over the regression. It's kind of busy, but there's a few things. One thing that I want to highlight. We measured financial IQ, which is how good you are with money, and because I'm bad with money, I end up buying or engaging in frivolous consumption a lot. At least that's what my partner tells me. And that's what we observe in the experiment as well. So people that are at the lower end of financial IQ, they actually end up, that have higher financial IQ, they end up consuming less in our experiment. We were worried about whether it's confusion, but it has nothing to do with clarity of instructions or anything like that. It's just, people that are a little bit more astute with their money are consuming less in our experiment. Okay, now I want to quickly turn to what explains these borrowing patterns. So whether or not people engage in borrowing money. So far, we haven't talked about loans. Now I'm going to talk about loans and how they work. So here's the main result. This is for all the loan treatments. So now in all treatments, loans are available. On the left are similar to what we had before, when endowments are equal and just given to you. And on the right are when endowments are unequal and based on effort and can signal ability. And what I'd like you to focus on is it's basically the same pattern that we saw before. When consumption becomes conspicuous, when you can signal ability with it and other people can see it, loan taking, on the y-axis, these are total loans. Sorry, I forgot to say that. So your outcome variable is loans. Loan taking increases significantly. I mean, it's small numbers. It's expressed as a percentage of the endowment, but still, it's a pretty, massive increase. I mean, almost a tripling of loans when your peers can observe what you're purchasing. Regression. I'll glaze over this because I'm out of time, but here's the next result. Which income group takes out more loans? So what we do is we focus on these last two treatments where there's inequality, right, because of this effort task. And we look at the lowest income earners in a given group and the third highest income earners, second highest income earners, and highest income. And what you see is most of the loan taking is concentrated amongst the lowest income earners. There's a little bit of increase in the highest income earners as well, but the scale of the lowest income earners is much larger. Okay? This is when expenditure becomes observable relative to not. Sorry, my alarm went off. I'm out of time. I'm going to take 2 more minutes, Hamna. I'm very sorry.
No problem. You have 3 more minutes.
Yes. All right. Okay. So this is basically expenditure over rounds, broken out by income strata. So top left is the poorest. Let's call them poor. Top right, bottom right is the richest. Yeah. And blue bars are expenditure is not observable. Red bars are expenditure is observable, and focus on the first 3 rounds where the loans matter, right? Because what you're doing is front loading your consumption. The poorest actually spend way more thanks to loans when expenditure is observable. You don't see that happening in the other income strata, except for the richest. In the second round, they increase it by a little bit. But the scale of the increase, again, for the poorest is massive. So you can clearly see that this increase in loan taking is coming from this increase in expenditure amongst the poorest. And then this is the final result, and then I'll conclude. The last thing we wanted to know was whether or not, if you're in the loans world, where you can use loans to, engage in consumption, versus the no loan world, does that have any effect on inequality? So does that exacerbate inequality? And the way that we came up with this measure is a little bit complicated. You might like it or you might not. But what we do is, for each group, we look at the income share of each of its group members before consumption and after consumption. So remember, in these sets of things, we have a coding task and then we have a consumption phase. So what we can do is we can look at the income share of each group member before the consumption phase and after the consumption phase. And we can do it with the loans treatments and then the no loans treatment. Okay, so to identify the effect that consumption has on the inequality levels, right? Income shares. And this is what we have. So again, the top left is the poorest, the bottom right is the richest, but the bottom are the two richer groups, so above average, and the top are the below average groups. Gray lines are without loans. Black lines are with loans. The dots on the left are the income share before the consumption phase, and the right is income share after the consumption phase. I'm a bad scientist, which is why these graphs are not scaled from 0. But if I scale them from 0, they would be very, very hard to see. So I kind of blew them up. But the key thing is the only difference that's significant is this one right here, which is with loans. So what you see is for the poorest, their income share drops with loans, but remains stable, even goes up a little bit with that when loans are not accessible. For the other groups, with loans, their income share goes a little bit higher, and that's because of these poor, the poor borrowing more, again, to signal status. If you want me to blow it up even further, become an even more bad scientist, here you can see clearly that that's where the significant difference lies. Okay, so what we're saying is this is evidence for this exacerbating inequality, that with loans, to facilitate consumption, remember this is a closed lab environment, you can only use it to facilitate consumption. The income share of the poorest drops in a bid to signal status, giving us some more evidence in favor of, again, returning to the Biju Rao's quote from his 2004 paper, poor families taking on lots and lots of debt in a bid for expensive weddings. But again, expensive weddings are really synonymous with signaling status. And of course, I mean, I'm married as well. You know, when I asked my family, why are you spending all this money? The response was, you know it, karna padta hai. So karna padta hai. Okay, so here's the last little bit. So conclusions, you know, every so often the literature talks about status. It's really important, but in economics, we haven't, you know, in sociology, they talk about this a lot more than we do. It's starting to, but this literature kind of resurfaces every decade or so. There's a spur of papers and then it dies down again. And so what we're trying to do is sort of add or contribute it, to this. We find evidence for status signaling. And I guess in a lab environment where the subjects don't know each other, these are anonymous decisions. They walk out of the lab. They don't walk out with any pictures. They don't even know who they were paired with. No prospect of post-game play, doesn't even signal ability in the way that you normally would think about it. And yet, they still engage in consumption to signal status. And alongside that, though, when you open up access to credit to engage in these sorts of things, people borrow money, and the borrowing of the money gets concentrated amongst the poorest, yielding this keeping up with this Joneses effect, which, by the way, some people, I didn't have time to talk about Atif Mia and Amir Sufi's paper, but some of the macroeconomist explanations for the housing crisis or the housing bubble was related to exactly these sorts of phenomena. Okay, and with that, I'll conclude. I'm really sorry for taking more time.
No problem. That was a very interesting talk, Sheheryar. So we have a couple of questions. Aisha has asked that, how do you think that, how does what you've talked about relate to institutional structures in Islamic civilization and teachings related to excess expenditure? And can we correlate the study by the principles taught in Islam?
That's a tough one. Thank you, Aisha, for that question. I'm not an Islamic scholar, as you know. In fact, I might be embarrassed to admit that I'm not entirely certain which principles we're talking about. So I don't think I'm necessarily qualified to comment on whether or not it conforms to this. I mean, one thing that I will say is that, I mean, it's not just Islam, but every religion tends to warn against this idea of excessive um, expenditure. Yeah? And the reason why a lot of this comes through is because the pull to engage in excessive expenditure is really, really strong. I mean, we want nice things, but we also, I mean, we want to make ourselves happy. And the thing is that when one of our peers gets something nice, we also want something nice, right? So um, it's not even so much coming from an area of competition, although that probably explains some part of it. It's just sort of, in some sense, it's the status-seeking behavior. If you read Veblen, goes well beyond, pre-industrialized societies and things like that. So I think it corresponds to it, but I think that's pretty much, I'm at the breadth of my expertise on the relationship with Islamic principles.
Right.
Yeah.
So Simon Quinn from University of Oxford, he has a question. Simon?
Hi, can you hear okay?
Yes.
Yes, hi, Simon.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for a super interesting presentation.
Thank you.
If it's okay, I've got a question and then maybe just a general comment. One is,
Yes.
Did I understand correctly that in the basic specification, these guys are spending half of their income on consumption in this game?
Yes, that's right. 60%, in fact.
60%. Because if you just go to your second last, like the summary conclusion slide.
This one?
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting result, but you say in a clean lab environment with no prospect of post-game play, subjects still engage in costly consumption to signal status. I mean, I think it's a fascinating starting point that they spend 60% of their income just to have a graphic on the screen for a few minutes. In some respects, you see what I mean? In some respects, it begs the question of why they do that. Because the signaling then obviously happens on top of that. It doesn't take away from the cleanliness of the signaling result, but in some respects it's interesting that there's obviously some kind of utility or something that they're getting, or they just think it's a bit of fun or something. Yeah.
No, certainly, Simon, that's a great point. I mean, we don't, so we don't talk too much about this in the paper because we don't have maybe a lot to actually explain this. I mean, part of it is, we take away their phones. They have to sit there for 30 minutes. Right. And so you would expect, I mean, we kind of front load it, because I was, of course, worried when designing this. I was like, why is anybody going to buy anything? This is crazy. And yet, so it is kind of boring, and that is certainly explains part of the reason why consumption occurs. And so, but we don't really have much to, like if I'd measured patients appropriately and whether if I was able to correlate that would be interesting.
Sure.
I will also say, Simon, I think that's an interesting point that you make, because one of the precursor papers, Klingsmith and Sheheryar, I mean, they don't find that, right? So they don't have, their baseline specification has very low levels of spending for these chocolate truffles. So there's already something sort of interesting here. And I wish I had more data to kind of pick that apart.
For sure. And second, maybe just a brief comment. I'm sorry, I'm not even sure it's a question, but thinking about, say, weddings or other kinds of potentially conspicuous consumption, it seems to me that a lot of what's going on there as well is that this is going to provide a lifetime's worth of memories. And so in some respects, it might almost be signaling to self that I want to be able to look back forever and see the elephant or the white horse or the fireworks, or, or whatever it was. And I know your experimental design is very careful to be able to separate which part is genuinely conspicuous and which part is not. But it does seem that some of this outlandish consumption might have justifications in the real world that have nothing to do with signaling to others. But that's really just an observation.
No, I think that's an important one. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, it's signaling to self as well can be just as important. Yeah. And in fact, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we were sort of trying to be careful about having these sort of baseline treatments where you can just have it without observability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much.
And Sheheryar, there's some more questions. So Jazib Pervez asks, do you think conspicuous consumption during marriage celebrations, is it a function of how well connected families are?
So, I mean, some of this, I mean, some of the evidence, so I'm thinking back to, for example, I would refer to the Bloch, Rao and Desai paper, the 2004 paper, because that specifically looks at wedding celebrations and expenditure on wedding celebration. And although they're not, I mean, it's 2004, but this is really before we in economics knew how to do networks properly. But they have an anthropologist and they do a lot of qualitative work in that paper as well. So it's a really nice paper. And they do have some effects. So that certainly explains part of their results. So wedding celebrations are correlated with, number of people that you know and so on. But it doesn't necessarily break away from status signaling, right? I mean, more people that you know, the more you want to signal status in the social hierarchy, that sort of thing. So in the real world, these things become very, very difficult to disentangle. And one of the things that, this why the lab slide was really trying to do, say that, which is the lab allows you to kind of pick things apart very cleanly and draw out these sorts of attributions. But I would refer to the Bloch, Rao, and Desai paper for that. No.
Then we have just enough time for a couple of more questions. Basit Naqvi asks, is there explicit evidence which estimates that people with low financial IQ spend more? And there's a related question by Sadia Siddiqui who asks, how is financial IQ defined?
All right, sorry. So I'll be clear about this. Okay, so we picked up financial IQ. Where's that reference? Hold on. I kind of don't even want to call it financial IQ. It's a small study. It's a lab study. We have university undergraduates. They're probably on the higher end of the spectrum of financial IQ anyway. So I wouldn't read into too much real world behavior from this financial IQ. We picked up this, in case you're interested, we picked up this measure from Van Ruij, Lusardi, and Alessi, their 2011 paper. It's a very simple 5-item questionnaire, measures numeracy, inflation, compound interest, money illusion. And it's basic questions like, you have $200 today, in a year from now, what will you have? Less than 200, more than 200, or you put it in a savings account, it pays 2% interest. How much will you have? 100, 204, more than 204. So it's very basic financial IQ questions. Now, with respect to this relationship between consumption and financial IQ, yeah, we see a relationship within the confines of the lab. We can't attribute it to paying attention. We have the cognitive reflection test to measure paying attention. We see that there's some relationship there. This is net of that. We have questions about, did you understand the instructions? This is net of that. So it's something about how well you understand money. Whether it's generalizable to the real world, can't say. So I wouldn't read too much into it. But if you're interested more, this is the paper to look at for financial IQ. Yeah.
And then Heyman asks, can we introduce savings in the model, and what would be the likely findings?
So that's a good question. Of course, so I suppose you could. And what you might expect to see is probably more disparity, right? So right now it's people, you either spend it or you sit on it. If you give people a third action where it's you sit on it or save it, then chances are people will just save it, not sit on it, because sitting on it would be you know, silly, but then they're also buying pictures of virtual items, so that's also silly. But saving, so what would most likely happen is it would exacerbate inequalities. Yeah. So right now our results on inequality are very thin because it's quite small. In the real world, inequality looks a lot wider, right? It's a lot more massive. And one of the reasons is you might not be sitting on money, right? You're saving it, it's growing. So people who aren't consuming, they're growing their money. People who are consuming, they're not growing their money. And so you have like this dispersion. Yeah, that would be my guess. But it's an interesting thing to think about.
And then so there's a comment by Shaheen who has said that this is likely to be an underestimate of the actual results in the real world. So the participants in the lab experiment in developed countries are apparently more accustomed to a responsible consumption pattern, so they're likely to provide a lower bound estimate.
Lovely. And this brings us back to the slide I nicely skipped over, which was why the lab. Where is it? Yeah. So why do you want to even use the lab to study this? Okay. So what's clear is, and this is actually, the comment is about external validity. And what's clear is the lab is not set up for external validity. I mean, we'll make some claims and you'll make me say some claims, but it's not necessarily, that's not the primary focus, right? So whether or not it's an underestimate, overestimate, who knows? I most likely agree that it is an underestimate. In the real world, there's lots of people, lots of income brackets, lots of different levels of paying attention, behavioral biases, all that noise, absolutely. The main purpose in doing these with lab studies, as I told you, I mean, we have all these observational studies that present results that look like status seeking, right? So you'll see an item. I mean, even if you look, I've bought a expensive car once in my life. Worst decision I ever made, right? And you could say, oh, well, you did it because you wanted to signal status. Do you know why I did it? I happened to go into the Audi dealership and they were really, really nice to me. And that was it. It's so silly, but they were very nice to me. And every time I went back, they called me Dr. Banuri and they treated me like I was a person, and they didn't have slick car salesmen. They're like, oh, come check it out. So it's not just that maybe their cars are better than a Corolla or whatever, I don't know. But that's the reason why I did it. So the real world can get very, very messy. And you can look at that and you can say, oh, well, this is obviously Sheheryar is trying to signal status to people, to other economists who don't care about this stuff. But really, it was just a matter of being treated nicely. So I will say that, that I'd be careful about making these sorts of conclusions based on the real world, based on this. But the idea is that what we do is heighten internal validity. So we're identifying the effect, and so that we can attribute it as cleanly as possible to things like status. And then the other side of it is replication, right? So if you don't believe it, run it. I'll give you my software, run it in your lab. If you want to test external validity, and this is hard, all of people who work in the field know this, but we could try and develop a version of this for the field to try and boost external validity. So that's my sort of little 2 cents on that. But it's a great point, and I'm really happy that was brought up.
So we've run out of time, and there's just one last question, Sheheryar, Dr. Banuri, if you could answer that, please. And Muhammad Khan wants to ask that question. Muhammad, can you hear us? It doesn't seem like we can hear him. I guess then Sadia has asked if this has been replicated in the field, the SLAP experiment, and I guess that is probably the last question and comment that we have for today.
No, it hasn't. That's an easy one. No, it hasn't. It's brand spanking new. We're just working on the first paper right now, so we're welcoming any comments and thoughts. And by the way, if anybody has any parting thoughts or other questions, please feel free to reach out to me and let us know. We're revising it as we speak, so we'd be more than happy to take it. And if you want to do a field version of this, I mean, there's some clever ways that I can think of to do a field version of this. So I'm happy to collaborate on something like that as well.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Please don't forget to tune in again next Tuesday for another very exciting talk. And thank you, Dr. Banuri, for joining us today and giving us time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheheryar.
Thank you, Naveen. Thank